You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 415 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Trump, U.S. sanctions on Venezuela and Iran, and some updates on what's happening in Syria. I need everybody to share the show. You do that at thelibertarianinstitute.org. The show, along with the daily news roundup that I write, are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage there. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. The show has its own podcast feed, but there's also the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed where you'll find my show and former guests like Pete Quinones, Scott Horton, and Phil Gibson. And last, there's a Patreon page if you want to donate to the show. That's patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And so the first thing I have on today's show is the House voting to, for the rules to impeach Donald Trump. This wasn't the actual House vote for impeachment, which then would still go to the Senate and require the Senate to actually vote to remove Donald Trump from office. I don't want to get too much into the political analysis here because, there are some actual foreign policy aspects to this that I would like to talk about on the show. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but just, so people know where I'm coming from on this. I'm not 100% convinced that the House is going to end up voting to impeach Donald Trump. Maybe somewhere along the line politically, this turns out to be not a winner and they start to back off on it and kind of just let it die. But, I guess it's possible that the House does vote to impeach Donald Trump. In that case, I don't think that the Senate will vote to remove him from office, as he has the Republican majority there. So, again, just where I'm coming from, I don't think that this will end up with Donald Trump removed from office. In a way, that's a shame because I think there are real scandals to talk about with Donald Trump, especially on the war issues that I've highlighted so many times on the show. But, just looking at Ukraine, I think there's a place where I would much, if I were a Democratic candidate, stand on going into 2020 and, target the, president for. And that's actually not his, alleged quid pro quo to, withhold this aid from Ukraine in exchange for investigating the Bidens, but rather the fact that he started this aid in the first place. Now, if you'll remember back to some of the early shows I did on the Russiagate saga, the U.S. actually wasn't giving military aid to Ukraine under the Obama administration, and one of the alleged signs that Donald Trump was somehow a puppet of Vladimir Putin was that, I guess, the Trump faction of whatever Republican Party power structure there was took something out of the Republican Party platform, which I think for most people is just utterly meaningless. The party platforms are just something that the 0.001% of Democratic insiders squabble over, but in total doesn't mean a whole lot. Well, anyways, he took out the part about supporting military arms to Ukraine. Well, he becomes president and he actually gives them arms anyways, and gives military aid to Ukraine, and this has included those Javelin missiles. Now, it's very interesting because, there's been bills proposed in the Congress called the Stop Arming Nazis Act that would essentially prevent this aid from going to Ukraine because there's some very nasty factions within the Ukrainian military structure, and this includes neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion and other people who share, loyalties and, ideologically believe in like Stefan Bandera and his version of Nazism that was practiced in Ukraine. So, these are some real bad dudes that are in the Ukrainian military again. And while the U.S., will say, we're making sure that the weapons don't go to those factions, simply empowering the military in general is empowering them. And, I think something like you've seen in Syria, much like Ukraine, that the radicals tend to be pretty effective fighters, I guess. And so, if they're the ones making military advances, they're the ones making gains. And if they're supported by those weapons, even if they're not directly used by them, it still seems to, be a real problem of arming up, a military tied to neo-Nazis. So I think that's the real scandal here. That's what I would target Trump for, not, again, the alleged quid pro quo, which I don't think actually exists. My guess is that at Trump's age and his main dealings, as he's done, and as people suggest, fairly dirty dealings, and, not necessarily a fair negotiator trying to screw the guy, the other guy for every cent he has. Trump is probably, careful enough not to, make any kind of direct quid pro quo statements. And he's, kind of got these other things that he's talked about, like other European powers should be picking up the bill giving military aid to Ukraine, not the U.S., and a general hesitation towards it. So that's a big topic that a lot of people are talking about. So I did want to weigh in on the foreign policy angles that I think are there. Again, I think more or less, did Trump, actually ask for a quid pro quo here? No. Maybe is that what he was going for? To try to at least incentivize the Ukrainians a little bit to investigate Biden? Maybe. I think he has more legitimate concerns, I guess, with, any Ukrainian involvement in the origins of Russiagate. But again, from the transcript that I saw of the call, it doesn't seem like Donald Trump has any real understanding of what role Ukraine may have played there anyway. So I'm not sure it's going to net him anything. All right, elsewhere in the White House, Stephen Biegun, again, this is the guy who has been leading at least parts of the U.S. talks with North Korea. I talked about on the show, this was something that was covered. In the days leading up to the Hanoi summit, he was suggesting the U.S. would offer some kind of acceptable deal to the North Koreans. And of course, Bolton comes in, apparently usurps the top negotiator position and, kind of has Trump hand the North Koreans a deal filled with poison pills that the Koreans obviously say no to. And so, in that way, it doesn't seem like this Stephen Biegun or Biegun guy is maybe the worst possible pick, for a number 2 position in the State Department. However, I don't think that he has any kind of firm non-interventionist, anti-war, just even in general aversion to war. This just seems like he was put in charge of these negotiations, and he's going, done his research, and he's trying to get a passable deal done. Apparently, he will retain his duties negotiating with North Korea, and, something really needs to happen there, and soon. I think that North Koreans seem to be getting pretty impatient with the status quo. Tulsi Gabbard introduced a bill basically invoking the War Powers Act that says the president doesn't have congressional authorization to wage the war in Syria, and this would require him to bring the troops home. She's absolutely right. There is no congressional authorization for it, but there's not congressional authorization for many of U.S. wars, including the war in Yemen, which the House and the Senate actually did pass a War Powers Act that Trump vetoed, and it was then overridden. So as far as this being an actual path to stop the war in Syria, seems unlikely to me. With some of the, consensus that we have seen. The consensus that we see in the House and the Senate in the past couple of weeks has been, for more intervention in Syria, not less. So my guess is, that's where it's going, that this bill will go nowhere. But for Tulsi, especially being on the campaign trail, maybe she could get a question about this in the debate. And, we do know that there's grassroots support for, ending some of these wars that we have going on. Another issue that maybe Tulsi will take up, apparently veterans are coming back from wars, especially multiple tours of duties, and suffering from increased rates of cancer. As you libertarians out there can imagine, the government bureaucracy that tries to manage veterans' health care is terrible and disgusting. And so these veterans are often, I think, not getting the care they need, suffering and not getting enough recognition of their various diseases. So, not getting the care they need. And of course, 90% of politicians will stand up and vote the soldiers and their sacrifices to argue for future war. But, so few actually do anything meaningful to get, veterans any kind of better care. Last up on some U.S. news, I have Russia telling the U.S. that the New START treaty, it's too late in the negotiation cycle, with now, I bet, a year and about 3 months left to renew the thing, to negotiate a whole new deal, which, is what you hope when you sign the New START treaty, is that rather than this being the new minimum standard for everything, what it becomes is the new standard for getting deals done. And so, you show that, hey, we both complied with the New START treaty. Things are going well, rather than just extending the deal. Let's go ahead and get rid of another half our nuclear arsenal because, this thing is going the right direction. Doesn't seem like that'll happen. So we need to hope for an extension. Russia said that there's probably going to need to be like 6 months of negotiation before this could be done. One of the problems with that is it means it's going to have to start in the Trump administration during the heavy campaign season in 2020. Julian Assange, is suffering in this UK maximum security jail now. A UN independent human rights investigator has said that, the current trial and situation is putting Julian Assange's life at risk. And so, again, this is another warning flag going up. Hey, that we can't let this political assassination of a journalist happen on our watch. It's too important to not only the life of somebody who's kind of dedicated themselves to exposing the truth and, trying to protect Julian and save the life of a man who has done so much to defend the truth. That's important. But the, kind of the bigger scheme of what the American empire is able to do to dissidents, if they kill Julian Assange in jail and, nobody really ever faces any kind of repercussions from it, it's going to, I think be a very dark day for truth. All right. So south of the border here, I want to talk about what's going on in Mexico because Trump's on Twitter offering U.S. assistance. It seems like some kind of either military or, it's kind of interesting that you wouldn't call militarily equipped federal police forces as military when they're deployed overseas. But that's essentially, I guess, what would be maybe some DEA agents trained up by the military and deployed with American military equipment running around in maybe black instead of camouflage fighting with Mexican police. But, Trump is floating that. And of course, in the past week, he's announced this new big crime push. I think he called it a surge, maybe invoking the idea of Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, those surges absolutely failed and resulted in a bunch of dead civilians. So hopefully the pattern doesn't hold, but if the pattern does hold, it means a whole bunch of innocent dead Americans being gunned down by American police and military equipment. So with that, this incident happening in Mexico that prompted Trump, I guess, there's a Mormon family traveling in Mexico, got caught in some crossfire, and then were maybe kidnapped. Several people dead, including some children. It is absolutely horrific what happened. Again, and I may have that story wrong, but that's the general thing. Gang and drug violence in Mexico wound up with some, American tourists or mercenaries or whatever kind of work they were doing down there, being slaughtered for absolutely no reason. So it seems like Trump's going to try to, use this family to insert more American intervention into Mexico, with some kind of either arms or, soldiers trained up to go down there. I'm sure it'll be an absolute mess. The solution here is obviously to decriminalize the drugs. On Trump's actual just surge portion of what's happening in the U.S., I have an article in the show notes page by Mike Maharrey that you all should check out, explaining why this is unconstitutional. And then there's another one that I'll have in the show notes page by Thomas Knapp, and this one explains why Trump shouldn't deploy U.S. forces into Mexico. All right, sanctions. The U.S. applied new sanctions on Venezuela. This one targeted 5 individuals. Heavier sanctions placed on Iran. Some of those sanctions were against Iranian construction sector, and so I think this is going to be pretty critical. If they're prevented from importing construction goods, it could really hurt their economy, prevent them from rebuilding. Also, Iran is responsible now and signed contracts for rebuilding Syria's electrical grid. And so they're, deprived of construction materials that may make that process slower. And, that means Syrians spending more and longer time as refugees are living in worse and worse conditions. On the 40th anniversary of the Iranian students taking some American diplomats hostage for, I believe, 444 days in Iran, the U.S. implied some sanctions on Iran. This includes sanctioning 9 members of the Ayatollah's inner circle, including his son. in response, and also I think, be on the anniversary of that consulate incident, Iran made some announcements of their own dealing with their commitments to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Of course, this is an agreement that the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from, and so now, by what Iran says is the letter of the deal, and it's absolutely true, they are allowed to walk back their commitments towards the deal as well. And this now includes, I guess, doing more industrial grade work at the Fordow nuclear facility. This, under the JCPOA, was turned into a research facility, but now they've reactivated some nuclear processes that is turning it more into, I guess, an industrial and, of course, civilian nuclear energy site. My understanding is that they were under the deal using this site to somehow stabilize some things in order to use it for civilian purposes outside of energy, so like medicines and stuff like that. But now they're, again, converting this into being able to use for nuclear energy. I guess the difference between the two is that if they're using it for like kind of the medical isotopes and stuff like that, is that if Iran ever decided that they want to build a nuclear weapon, the industrial energy would get them closer to the nuclear material they need faster than if they're just isolating medical isotopes. So it's very unfortunate that the Trump administration withdrew from the deal, as this was a predictable consequence. Iran has also announced they've installed upgraded centrifuges. They say that these centrifuges spin material 10 times faster than the centrifuges that they had under the JCPOA. In fact, these current centrifuges are ones that they've actually either destroyed or had deactivated under the agreement. And so again, predictable consequence of the Americans leaving the deal. Now Iran's walking back their commitments. And so, of course, you have war hawks in the U.S. screaming, Iran's trying to build a bomb. Look at all the things they're doing. We got to stop them. Well, no, they're just going back to the conditions of their civilian nuclear energy program that were in place before the JCPOA was signed. They agreed to additional safeguards in exchange for having sanctions lifted. Because the sanctions are back, they're going back to what they were doing before. They also said they're now working on a more advanced centrifuge that would spin material 50 times faster. This sounds a little bit like propaganda to me, but there may be some truth in that, they are developing more advanced systems. I want to note that the U.S. did say they were expanding sanction waivers for several different companies that are working to restructure some of Iran's nuclear sites that were part of the JCPOA. So I think this includes rebuilding the Arak reactor in a way where it's still going to produce energy, but in a far smaller capacity than before, and again, getting Iran further away from having nuclear material needed to build a bomb, should they ever want to build one, which they currently don't. In 2017, leaders in Catalonia helped set up and conduct an independence referendum that passed. Because of this, the Spanish government targeted Catalonia's leadership and imprisoned some and, forced some into exile. They have been seeking from the European Court and various other countries to extradite these officials, and every time so far it's been taken up, countries have refused, saying that no, this is completely bogus. So Spain's Supreme Court just reissued the warrant for 3 former members of the Catalonian leadership, and I believe 2 of them are living in Belgium and 1 in Scotland. In Afghanistan, 9 children were killed by a landmine in a Taliban-controlled area. I guess these were children of Taliban fighters killed by a Taliban landmine. From Israel, we have a leaked video showing several members of the Israeli police, I guess, pointing guns at a Palestinian walking up to the checkpoint. I believe he was in the West Bank, being told to turn around and walk backwards. The man did. He was then shot by the police officer in the back with what they're calling a sponge-tip bullet. And, this is the quote-unquote non-lethal crowd control devices that Israeli use, which killed plenty of people. Apparently, the police officer was dismissed from her post for this, but has since now serving out a commitment within the Israeli military. So equally disturbing that somebody who's this deranged is, now an armed soldier. It does seem like this video presented the situation in a clear enough way that enough people understood what happened here was absolutely wrong, even though it was the Palestinian that was shot by the Israeli. The common narrative is that only Palestinians attack Israelis, not the other way around, which is, absolutely untrue, like most establishment narratives. But in this case, it was so blatant that what she did was absolutely disgusting, that she may get a slap on the wrist for this. Iraq protests, back out in the streets. The Iraqi government certainly isn't responding as lethally as last time, but we still have civilian casualties racking up. At least 13 protesters have been killed so far Monday and Tuesday night this week. This includes several people who were killed by, again, this non-lethal kind of crowd control devices like rubber-coated bullets and tear gas canisters have killed several people now. The protesters in Iraq are also doing things like blocking roads in and out of ports and protesting at the ports themselves, also attacking Iranian consulate positions. At one time, I think they wrecked one pretty well and then put up an Iraqi flag. All right, some updates on Syria here. At the end of last week, I had talked about a skirmish between Syrian and Turkish soldiers leading to 6 dead Syrians and 18 captured. Well, Turkey has handed over those 18 soldiers to Russia, and I guess, they have since been released. Turkey continues to complain that the safe zone isn't being freed enough of armed Kurds, and they are complaining at both Russia and the United States for not kind of meeting their obligations on this. I have no idea how true it is. My guess is that Turkey probably sees any Kurd with a rifle as a PKK militant, and, from the Syrian Kurds who maybe live in the area, who lived through ISIS and are now, kind of in this very difficult area where there's Turkish-backed jihadists, pushing into their territory, and you're now just kind of relying on the good graces and, a shaky deal with Assad and Russia to continue to, kind of protect you from that threat. Maybe you do want to have a rifle. So where at this point, what Turkey is labeling the PKK and just an armed population, what the difference there is, I think that's possibly what's causing the confusion. Or, maybe Turkey is disingenuous and just saying that because they really have a very deep-seated, at least the government there, a deep-seated resentment of the Kurds and doesn't seem to care too much about killing a lot of them. There's an article at antiwar.com, I'll link to this one on the show notes page, about U.S. soldiers in Syria not really understanding what their orders are. This could be dangerous as, Assad, Russia, Iranian bad forces, various jihadists, Syrian Kurds, a lot of armed groups in the area with a lot of different ideas and, looking to take power and stuff, and the U.S. is holding on to key positions in these Syrian oil fields. If the soldiers don't exactly understand what their, mission and role is, it could lead to a position where, maybe they fire on some Russians, maybe they fire on some Syrians, and it sparks a bigger war. It seems like in a very general sense that the ceasefire along the border between Syria and Turkey and extending, 30 kilometers into Syria is holding that most of this territory is now controlled by the Syrian and Russian governments, although Turkey still controls some territory deep inside of Syria, as well as the United States possibly holding some territory in northeast Syria, as I continue to see at least reports that there's U.S. troops present in the region. Overall, it seems like, again, as far as I could tell, about 900 troops will remain in Syria between the Al-Tanaf base and these oil fields around Deir ez-Zor. All right, some quick updates on Yemen, especially because Trump tweeted about it today. And what he tweeted about was this deal that has been signed in the second capital of Aden. This is a southern port city between the separatists and the Saudi-backed government. I guess this calls for some restructuring of the Yemeni government. Of course, this is a Yemeni government in exile, doesn't even come into Yemen, and the territory controlled by this government is far less than half of the population. So Donald Trump said this is a great first step, looking for more. Maybe this is an indication that he's pushing Saudi Arabia to have more talks with the Houthis. Be great if this was the case, but this has certainly been flying around as a rumor for the past few years, and I'm not really ready to believe that Donald Trump is going to press the Saudis on this issue, that he cares at all about the genocide that's happening in Yemen. On that, Daniel Larison at the American Conservative has a great write-up on the number of dead Yemenis piling up and how it's just been the most disgusting kind of war that has targeted so much civilian infrastructure, leading to so many unnecessary deaths. Last thing I want to mention on the show today is AFRICOM put out a statement that said they have completed their drone base in Niger and are now authorized to operate armed and unarmed air missions in Niger. So I'm guessing that, in the next 6 months or so, we will be able to report that Donald Trump is bombing that country in a more official sense than in the past where, maybe it is happening. The U.S. government has certainly hinted at that they're carrying out armed missions here, but this is a pretty blatant statement. It seems to be more public. All right. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. Check out at KYAAALE on Twitter, facebook.com/foreignpolicyfocus.